This section deals with ledger entries, in other words, using the general ledger to show how you would post from your journals to your ledger. Firstly, let's start with what goes where. If you haven't revised the section on accounting equation yet, it might be a good idea to do that first so that you just refresh your memory about the accounting equation and all its elements. In this case, let's just then look at what happens when we have assets, liabilities, expenses, and incomes, and where will they be shown in the general ledger or in the T account. We call it a T account because of the shape of the account, and you can see that clearly on the slide here as well. Just remember that there is a reason why the debit entry is done on the left-hand side and the credit entry is done on the right-hand side, and that's really because the words debit and credit is Latin for left and right. So debit means left and credit means right, and that's why in the T account, when we do a debit, we do it on the left-hand side, and when we do a credit, we do it on the right-hand side. Okay, so let's revise just very quickly what goes. On an asset, when an asset increases, it increases on the left-hand side or on the debit side, which means that it then reduces on the credit side. Liability is exactly the opposite. A liability increases on the credit side and reduces on the debit side. And expenses and incomes looks the same as assets and liabilities then. So an asset will increase on the debit side and decrease on the credit side. So it looks the same as an asset. And an income will increase on the credit side and reduce on the debit side, so it looks the same as a liability. The difference between incomes and expenses is owner's equity. So if you have a look at that, then owner's equity gets dealt with similarly to liabilities, which means that anything that increases owner's equity, in other words incomes, will be shown the same as liabilities, in other words increasing on the credit side as income is, and anything that reduces owner's equity will be shown on the left-hand side, and that's why expenses increase on the left-hand side or on the debit side. Please revise this again if you're not familiar with it, because this impacts your ability to be able to post from the journals to the ledger. I'm going to use the same examples that I did in the previous recording for journals. So if you haven't gone through the journals recording first, it might be a good idea to do that as well, although you will be able to follow this session without having done that previously. Let's have a look at the first one. The example previously was given for an entry into the cash receipts journal, and that entry was given as follows. ABC Bank paid us interest on the fixed deposit we have with them, 2,400 Rand. Because we're working with interest that we are receiving, and it's possibly cashed in or straight into our bank account, we entered it into the cash receipts journal. So if we have to look at the accounts involved, we'll see again that it's interest received and bank. Interest received is classified as an income, which means that it's owner's equity, which means that because it's increasing, it will do so on the credit side. And bank is classified as an asset, and an asset, in this case, that is increasing. And when an asset increases, it increases on the debit side. You can very easily, when you ask yourself these questions, see whether you've got the information correct, because there can only be one debit and one credit. Remember, the accounting rule is that for every debit, there must be a credit. So in this case, interest is an income, and my income is increasing, and therefore it is credited, and my bank is an asset. The asset is also increasing, and an asset increases on the debit side. So when I look at the ledger entry, then it will look something like this. The two accounts will be the two accounts that you've identified from before. So it will be bank and interest received. And what happens is that the information you put in the details column is exactly the name of the other account that you're using. So in the bank account, in the details column, you will use interest received because that is the other account you're using. And in the interest received account, in the details column, you will use the word bank because that is the other account you are working with. In other words, if you look at any ledger account, the name that is written in the details column, if you go and look in that account, you will see the corresponding entry. And that is why we use those names in there, so that we know where to go and look for the other entry. And remember, there must always be a debit entry and a credit entry. So in this case, we said that bank is an asset which increases, and it increases on the debit side, on the left-hand side, and therefore my entry is on the left-hand side. And interest is an income, and that increases on the right-hand side, and that's why the entry is on the right-hand side or on the credit side. If you look at the folio column, the folio column tells you where you got the information from. So when you post from journals, it will tell you from which journal you posted it. And in this case, it came from the cash receipts journal. We have a similar situation with cash payments. The transaction that we could have here is paid the monthly rent of 2,000 Rand to Maywood Properties via EFT. If we had to ask ourselves the 4 questions again, which 2 accounts are involved? Firstly, I'm paying rent, so it's rental paid or rent paid, and bank, because I'm paying it via EFT, so that is seen as cash, and it's done from my bank account. So what happens to my bank account in this case? Well, it reduces because I'm paying money out of it, and bank is classified as an asset, and an asset reduces on the credit side, so my bank will be credited. Rent paid, on the other hand, is an expense, and an expense has an effect on owner's equity. An expense, in this case, the expense increases. Remember, I've explained this in the previous sessions as well. When you have an expense, it means that the expense gets more because every time you pay it, the total for that expense becomes more in your books, but it actually reduces the value of your owner's equity because it reduces the profit that you make in the organization. However, in this case, we want to know that it's an expense that increases, and therefore it gets debited because expenses gets debited, it gets increased on the debit side. So I've got 1 debit and 1 credit, and I know that I've worked this out correctly. So what will the general ledger look like then? The 2 accounts is rent paid and bank, and again the details column in each of those will show the name of the other account that I use. So in the rent paid account, I will have the date being the 31st, details being bank. Folio is the journal where I got this information from, and in this case it will be the cash payments journal, and the amount is 2,000 Rand. And the corresponding entry to that will be the bank account, and that will happen on the right hand side, I said, because I'm reducing my asset, and the date is the 31st. Details is rent paid because that's the other account that I've used. Folio is the journal I got it from, cash payments journal, and the amount is 2,000 Rand. Okay, let's have a look at an example of the debtors journal. Debtors journal, we said, typically is when we sell goods on credit. So in this case, for example, sold goods on credit to Andrew Ball, 8,000 Rand, and issued invoice Z01. So if I had to ask myself my 4 questions again, which 2 accounts are involved? I sold goods, so sales is involved, and I sold it on credit, which means I have debtors because somebody owes me the money now. Debtors is an asset, and it increases because Andrew Ball now owes me more money, and an asset increases on the debit side. Sales is an income, and an income that's increasing because I've sold more goods, and an income increases on the credit side. So I've got 1 debit and 1 credit, and I know that I'm correct. What will the ledger look like? It will look as follows. Firstly, debtors or accounts receivable, if you're using the new terminology. My debtors account will be debited on the 31st with sales, because sales is the other account that I'm going to use that I've already identified. Folio column shows the journal where I got this information from, and it's debtors journal. The 1 just indicates that it's journal number 1. The business might have more than one journal that they're working from, and it will just indicate which number they're working with. And the amount is 8,000 Rand. So the other account I'm working with is sales, because I sold on credit. Date 31st, I'm entering on the credit side because sales is an income and my sales is increasing, so I increase the sales on the credit side. Details is debtors because debtors is the other account I worked with. Folio again shows which journal I got it from, in this case the debtors journal, and the amount is 8,000. As we said before, the debtors allowance journal shows the opposite entries. For example, received faulty goods back from Andrew Ball, 1,250 Rand, and issue credit note J12. That information you needed in order to put the entry into the debtors allowance journal. So let's just see what information we got. We know that the two accounts we're going to use again is debtors and sales, but this time it gets done the opposite too. In other words, when I receive goods back, Andrew Ball doesn't owe me as much anymore, so my debtors decrease, and debtors is an asset, and an asset decreases on the credit side. And my sales also decrease because I haven't sold as much anymore because he's not given me some of that stuff back. So sales is an income, and that income is decreasing because I haven't sold as much, and an income decreases on the debit side. So I've got one debit entry and one credit entry. What will the ledger look like? It will show the opposite to what it had before. So again, the two accounts I work with is sales and debtors. In terms of the sales account, on the left-hand side, it's a debit entry because I'm reducing my sales, and sales is an income, so it reduces on the left-hand side or on the debit side. Date 31st, details is debtors because debtors is the other account that I'm working with. Folio shows which journal I got it from, in this case debtors allowance journal, and the amount is 1250. Similarly, in my debtors account, my debtors is reducing because he's not owing me as much money anymore, and because debtors is an asset reduces on the credit side, so my entry in the debtors account is on the credit side. So date is the 31st, details is sales, folio is the journal where I got the information from, in other words debtors allowance journal, and the amount is 1,250 Rand. Okay, let's have a look at an example of the creditors journal. In this case, the entry said purchase stationery from Dan Traders for 10,000 Rand on credit, invoice 26. Some of that information you would have needed in order to do the journal entry. But for our purposes, let's have a look at the information. Firstly, what are the two accounts involved? Because I purchased on credit, creditors must be one of the accounts I use. And what did I purchase? I purchased stationery. So stationery is the other account. Creditors is a liability, and the liability is increasing because I now owe more money. I bought some stuff on credit, so I owe more money, so my liabilities are increasing, and liabilities increase on the credit side. The other account that I use is stationery. Stationery is an expense, and an expense that's increasing because I've bought more stationery, so I now have more stationery available to use in the organization, and an expense increases on the debit side. So from that I can see I've got one debit and one credit entry, and I know that I've indicated the two accounts correctly. What will the ledger entries look like? The two accounts is stationery and creditors. Stationery is my expense that increases, so it gets done on the left-hand side. Date is the 31st. Details is creditors because that is the name of the other account that I'm going to use. Folio indicates which journal I got this information from, and in this case it's the creditors journal, so it's CJ1, and the amount is 10,000 Rand. The other account that I'm using is creditors. My creditors is increasing, and because creditors is a liability, liabilities increase on the credit side, so my entry is on the credit side. Date is the 31st. Details is stationery because stationery is the other account that I'm using. Folio is CJ1, Creditors Journal 1, because that's where I got the information from, and the amount is 10,000 Rand. The opposite to that entry would be an example of the Creditors Allowance Journal. In other words, I returned some of the stationery that I bought from Dan Traders on credit because it wasn't mine. They included it in error on our order, 2,000 Rand worth of it, and they've issued us a credit note. So the accounts involved is creditors and stationery again, because I have to now adjust my creditors account. I have to reduce it, in fact, because I don't owe them as much because I've sent some of the stuff back. But I also have to reduce my stationery account because I've given the stationery back. It doesn't belong to me. It wasn't my order to start with, so I have to give it back. So the creditors account, therefore, is seen as a liability which reduces, and a liability reduces on the debit side. Stationery, however, is an expense that reduces, and an expense reduces on the credit side. So again, here I can see that I've got a debit entry and a credit entry, and I know that I am correct. What will the entry look like in the ledger? The two accounts are creditors and stationery. Creditors gets debited because I'm reducing my liability. So on the left-hand side, I will have date 31st, details stationery, because that is the other account I'm using. Folio will be which journal I got it from, and it's the Creditors Allowance Journal, CAJ1, and the amount is 2,000 Rand. Stationery gets credited on the other hand. Date is the 31st, details is creditors, and folio is CAJ1 because that's where I got the information from. In other words, details shows the other account that I worked with, and that was creditors. Folio shows where I got this information from, and it was the Creditors Allowance Journal, amount 2,000 Rand. Stationery is credited because it's an expense that is reducing, and an expense reduces on the credit side. Let's have a last look at the general journal entry. Typically, a general journal entry would be something like owner took stock for his own use, 230 Rand. The two accounts involved is drawings and inventory. It's called drawings when the owner takes something for his own use. And in this case, what did he take? He took stock. So stock or inventory is the name of the other account that I'm using. Drawings can be seen to have similar effect to an expense, but it's not an actual expense. What it is that it reduces my owner's equity because the owner now does not have such a big stake in the organization anymore because he took some stuff for his own use, which means that the owner's equity actually reduces, and owner's equity reduces on the debit or on the left-hand side. On the other hand, we have inventory. Inventory is an asset, and because the owner takes the inventory, my asset is reducing, and an asset reduces on the credit side. So again, I can see that I've got a debit and a credit entry, and therefore I know that I am correct because for every debit entry I must have a credit entry as well. So what will the ledger entries look like here? The two accounts is drawings and inventory. The drawings gets debited on the 31st with inventory because that's the other account I'm using. Folio is General Journal 1, GJ1, because that's where I get the information from, and the amount is 230 Rand. In opposite to that, inventory is the other account that I'm using. The date is the 31st. Details is drawings because drawings is the other account that's involved. Folio is General Journal 1 because that's where I got the information from, and the amount is 230 Rand. Okay, the last thing that is then left is for us to have a look at how to balance. Let's have a look at an example of a bank account just to make it a bit easier. Typically, you will have entries on the left-hand side or on the debit side, and you'll have entries on the credit side or the right-hand side. When you want to balance the account, you need to add up the debit amounts and the credit amounts to see what you get. In this case, if you look at the entries on the debit side, we have interest received, 2,400 Rand. We've got sales, 12,000 Rand, which gives us a total in the red at the bottom of 14,400. On the right-hand side, we've got rent paid, 2,000 Rand. We've got salaries, 10,000 Rand. And we've got advertising, 200 Rand, which if I add those three together, the amount in red that you'll see at the bottom there is 12,200. So we can see from here that the two sides aren't equal and that the debit side is bigger than the credit side. That effectively means that my bank account will have a debit balance. Because the bigger amount is on the debit side, it means that my bank account will have a debit balance. But in order for me to write that debit balance into the account, I need to first get the two sides equal to each other. And that's why when I want to balance out, I have to look at the side that has got the lesser amount, and I have to add in the amount that will balance the two sides out. So in this case, on the right-hand side, I have to add in an amount of 2,200 in order to balance the two sides out. Because the left-hand side is 14,400 at the moment, and the right-hand side is 12,200 only. So I need to add another 2,200 on the right-hand side in order to equal the two sides out. So when I do that, I call it balance carried down. So if you look on the right hand side now, below my transactions, I've got rent paid, I've got salaries, I've got advertising, and then I've got the amount that will equal my two sides out, and that is called balance carried down, 2,200 Rand. Because if I now add the left hand side and I add the right hand side, they both will equal 14,400. But I can't leave that balance amount there because that amount was only put in there to balance the two sides out. I now have to bring down that balance on the debit side to show that my debit side was actually bigger than my credit side, and that's the balance I start the new month off with. So if you look at the dates, you would have seen that the top section has got December the 31st, the last day of the month, and the balance that I bring down on the 1st of January is the 1st of the next month, and that is the 2,200 Rand. So I always bring down the balance on the opposite side to where I put it inside in order to get the two sides to balance. Okay, so just to recap, if I look at the debit side, my entries equal 14,400, but the entries on the credit side only equal 12,200. So I know that on the credit side, I have to add in a 2,200 amount, and that amount I add in is in order to get the two sides equal, to get them to balance. But I don't leave that balance there. I carry it down to the opposite side at the beginning of the next month to show that my debit side was actually bigger than my credit side, and it was bigger by the amount of 2,200 Rand. Okay, so that is then how you balance out a ledger account. In this case, we just use the example of bank.